We created this curve before. And what I want to do is use this curve to determine where the pieces are going to be activated. So let's just split off a little sidecar network off to the right over here. Based off of let's maybe bring it in at this point, because right here we've actually created looks like a p-scale attribute that we can use to possibly change the size of the region if we wanted to. So that's got all the information that I'm looking for. So I'm just going to basically split this off by using a carve. And I've got this carve. I can more or less use the carve to trim off pieces of, basically trim this curve to be smaller. Let's get the D key and change the background to dark. So this is what a curve does. First U, it just that's the first U point of the U attribute on the curve that's sort of implied by the length of it. And then the second one will actually trim it from the other side. And this is the one I want to actually animate. So let's just set a keyframe on the first frame on the second U by holding down the Alt key and clicking inside of there. And then I'll go out to frame 96 and then set this second U to a value of 1. So now when we go, when we play back, we get this kind of animation. It's running a little fast. I'm just going to hit the real time button down on the lower left, like so. And that's sort of our animation. I think that's good for right now. The next thing I want to do is delete off the rest of the points, because I want to actually copy a sphere that's going to be our activation region to the end of this animation. And if I were to throw it on a sphere and a copy to points, we should get a whole bunch of spheres along this curve, and they're all changing size according to the p-scale attribute, which is great. But I don't want all of these points. I just want one that kind of follows the end. So on this carve, I'll throw right after the carve, we'll throw it on delete. And we're going to do, we're going to delete points. So we're going to check points as our entity. And then we're going to go down here and say delete by range. And we're going to choose, if you look at the start and end, it goes from 0 to $n, which basically means that it's going to go from 0 to the number of points, and it's going to delete 1 of 2 points by default. So if I turn on this, let's see my guides. Let me just crank this up a little bit. So you see, before the carve, we've got all these points like so, and then before the delete, we've got all these points, and then when we click delete, we have only half the points. That's because it's deleting every other point using select one of 2. Now we want to delete all the points except for 1. So I'm going to say select 1 of 1. So every single point, literally, it's between 0 and n, it's going to delete. Except now I can go up here on this expression and type -1. So that basically means it's going to go from 0 all the way to the second to last point and delete all those points. So now I just get a point that follows along with the leading point of our curve. So if I copy a point onto that, I'm just going to template the carve so you can kind of see it. You see we get this sphere that sort of is just following along with that first, that last point in our carve. And we can use this point to, create a group that will allow us to delete those glue constraints. So I'm going to put down a null here, and I'm going to call this the activation region. Like so. Now what I can do is bring this into a if you look at over here in our .NET, our third input is a constraint solver. Much like how we used the SOP solver to activate our pieces before, we can use a SOP solver with our constraint network to sort of delete or manipulate our constraints as the simulation is running. So let's create one of those. So create a SOP solver, throw that down and wire it into the third input of the constraint network. And everything kind of falls apart. which is fine. I'm just gonna hit escape, and let's just jump into the SOP solver. So by default, the SOP solver has the display flag set to the DOP geometry. So basically what that means is what this is set to display is it's outputting the DOP geometry as the constraint network, which doesn't make any sense to the constraint network. So really, remember we had these other nodes that came in by default. Well, this one called relationship geometry is actually set to grab those constraints that we created earlier. So in here, what I could do is do an object merge, because this is just like SOPs. We can just merge in whatever we want from another SOP now. So let's bring in our activation region like so. And let's see, into this object. Cool. And you can see that as we do that, we get this sphere traveling along our relationship geometry. But over here in the context of this solver, we can use this to actually delete some of these glue constraints. So let's do that. So let's create a group. Wiring the relationship geometry into the left input and the object merge into the right. This is going to be a, let's do a primitive. I can't really do a primitive. If I do a point group, like so, it's going to select everything. I'm just going to disable the base group. I'm going to call this group something that makes sense, like just broke. And we're going to do we're going to use bounding regions, and we'll use a bounding object. The bounding object is coming in from the right, so it should start to, you can see that it's creating little point groups for us as it travels along here. And then we can use this group and then set it to delete. So I'm going to throw it on a blast. And set it to blast the just broke group. So now when we play this, you can see that it's deleting stuff out of our constraints. What I might want to do just to make sure that it's actually, I feel like what we should be doing is actually blasting away primitives and not points. So I'm creating this group based off of the bounding region for points, because the bounding object really only works with points or vertices, but then I can just group promote. So I'm going to promote that group from a point group to a primitive group. So I'm actually deleting the full primitive. So let's go select our just broke group, and we're going to convert it to primitives. So now we're deleting that chunk out there. So now on our just broke, it is deleting those primitives as it goes down. Now the primitives are coming back, but I believe that when we run this in our sim, they will remain they'll remain broken. So I'm just going to hop out of our simulation, and I'm going to hit play. And you can see that it has broken those constraints around the arm. It is traveling along the neck here and deleting constraints as it travels all along that curve that we had created earlier. Just going to let that play out briefly, and we'll kind of take a look at what we've got in when it's done caching. All right, so it is, I've let it kind of cache a little ways here, and you can see, I'm just going to play it back. You can see that it breaks the arm, the head falls off, kind of rests on the shoulder, then it falls off, and then it never, as we get to frame 96, it looks like if I just kind of, I'm just going to hide our geo here by selecting the RBD packed object, coming up here and unticking display geometry. You can see that one straggler constraint is holding this whole torso up from becoming detached. So if I play the constraints down, you can see that there's this one constraint right there that's sort of holding things together as we get down into this region. So I think like what I would do at this point to kind of fix that situation is I can just modify the scale of that sphere as it gets down to the bottom here. So back over in my here in my DOPNet, what I would do, or in my SOP network, is maybe instead of using this point VOP to determine the scale, maybe I'll just create my own. So I'll just copy this off over here. So I'm just going to option drag that point VOP we created to modify our P scale earlier. I'm just going to create a new one over here, and we're going to wire that one in instead. So now what we can do is I could actually make it get thicker towards the bottom. See how it gets small here? We could just change this so that it remains pretty large towards the end. And I can actually increase maybe the maximum size of it towards the end, so it keeps getting bigger and bigger. So maybe I'll just have this kind of ramp all the way up, and then the maximum value will set to something like 2. So now it's this larger region that would be going through and clipping our points. So let's just double check that by jumping into our SOP solver and kind of looking at and seeing what it does. So we go play this down. As it gets down to the bottom, it does clear that constraint right there, and it goes all the way through and breaks all those constraints down to it gets to a point where it looks like it won't matter because those points are inactive, but it will still break those constraints. Another thing that I'm seeing, and that looks like it's pretty good too. I was wondering if it was going to actually, if it actually cleared this part of the arm, but that looks like it's going to be good too. So let's just, now that we got that set, let's just go back and I'm going to turn the display geometry back on my RBD backed object, go back to frame 0. Even though I've made changes, we get this little warning here that says that it was cooked in immediate mode, so the results are not correct, but it hasn't cleared our cache. So to get this blue bar to go away, quick way, you can go down here to the brain and shift click on it, and it will reset out-of-date simulations. It still doesn't know. If you go and control click it, it will reset all simulations. So just control click the brain, it resets that timeline, and we can play it back some more. And so I'm going to watch this cache out, and we'll see if it actually ends up deleting out all of the torso. And now as we arrive to the latter part of this simulation, you can see that the torso has become detached in large part from the feet, which is cool, and it comes crashing down independently. So if I go back to frame 0, and I'm just gonna play this back so we can see what's happening. Arm breaks, the head falls, and then the torso kind of all falls. The torso all kind of falls as one chunk and then breaks apart more when it reaches the bottom. That's one of the cool things about the glue constraints versus the activation ones, is it'll keep things together if it can until it reaches a point, and then they will fall apart, which is pretty cool. So this is pretty cool as an effect. I mean, we've basically created this disintegration effect, but I wanted to take it just a little bit further and add some forces to create kind of like a cool, you know, sort of a cool exploding effect that sort of looks a little bit dreamy and a little bit more interesting than just a plain old disintegration. I'm also seeing something. I'm not really a fan of how this arm is remaining up like this, and it looks like some stuff gets kind of snagged down here. So I'm going to see what I can do to art direct that. It looks like we've got a little bit of an issue right here. So I think maybe what I might do is have our curve make like a little detour through here, and maybe I'll just increase the particle or the size of the activation region up here so that we can break all these constraints and have this arm fall over, because I'm not 100% liking how the head seems like it isn't like fully. The head kind of lands on the shoulder and rolls back. I guess it's not terrible, but I'm not liking how like this part of the arm is stuck here. So let's just fix that. So how I'm going to remedy this is I'm going to actually go back and I'm going to actually go over here, and I'm going to mess around with the this size of this polywire. I'm going to actually create more. If I look at our geo, I'm going to create a larger section that is fractured around here as well, so that we can actually engulf this full part of the arm. So I mean, really, this is the beauty of the nature of the procedural nature of this. I can actually change all this stuff around and it'll update everything. So let's just grab a couple points here. Let's just bring this point down. So I've selected my curve. I've got my manipulator selected here. I can actually bring this point below, and we're still snapping the points here, you can see. So I'm bringing this point below on the arm a little bit. I'm just going to bring it out like so. That's looking fine. Kind of wanted it to stay just sort of like that. And then what I'll do is I'll go over to my other point VOP here and just increase the size of it in this area. So I'm going to maybe, let's just bring the maximum value up to a value of 0.2. So I'm doubling the maximum value. But in the middle here, I'm going to half the size of this. So we're going to go put in a value of 0.5 there. And then I'll take the, let's see. Yeah, that should be good. And then over here, I'll just maybe add a point like so. And this second point, we'll make it a little bit bigger so that it actually fully encompasses that part of the arm. So we're going to get fractures that are going all throughout there. Then underneath the neck, maybe I'll bring this second piece of the ramp down a little bit so it gets tinier. And then we've got our chunk being carved out like so, which is good. I just want really basically this section of the arm to be completely engulfed by this geo. Let's see what it looks like with all of our other stuff going on here, like our VDBs with all of our noise. Looks like it's still taking a full chunk out of it, so that's good. So now I'm going to just actually go back down here to where we had our fracture pieces. Our fracture pieces are now going to change because we changed that geo. So I'm just going to grab this and click Save to Disk, and that's going to rewrite those pieces out and recook that whole network and give us new fracture geometry. So I'm actually going to turn the display flag off up here. And yeah, go back down here and just run this. So save disk, and I'll be back in a second. So after a quick 2-minute cook, let's see what we got. Throw it on an exploded view after our assemble, and we can see that that shoulder is just destroyed. There's no way, I don't think any of that is going to get hung up on anything. Cool. So let's just go back over to our sim. Going to delete that exploded view. It's going to hop over to the sim here and see what happens. It's got to do the convex decomposition and do the poly reducing. So it's going to be running through that real quick, and then we should be ready to sim in just a sec. There we are. All right, so let's see what we get. Cool. So this is sort of cached to memory. I'm just going to, just for the sake of entertainment, I'm going to just run a little flipbook of this back out on the high-res pieces. So I've got my transform pieces selected here, and I'm going to say flipbook with new settings. I don't want to do a resolution or a crop out view mask overlay. I just want to make a box recording the size of my viewport. And oh, I gotta click start. There we go. And I'm just going to hit escape to get it to stop. It was trying to go the full range. Didn't want to do that. So let's look at what we got here. And this in of itself is actually pretty satisfying, just for a disintegration effect. But I wanted to kind of bring it, let's just play around with some forces and kind of like take it a step or two further, just to make something, just see what we can do, have some fun. So I'm gonna just can that, and let's just go over here to let's create some forces to sort of kind of like almost like this thing's getting shot by bullets. So I'm going to let's branch off of this this curve that we've got here. We do have this carve that is occurring that is sort of bringing this point on, and then we have this delete, which is giving us the it should just be giving us that first point. So what we can do is maybe create some forces out of this. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to copy this setup here with the copy to points. And I'm just going to bring it over here. And then what we're going to do is maybe what we're going to do is maybe create some forces here. So I'm going to, instead of copying the sphere on here, I want to just copy, I've got the sphere, but inside this sphere, maybe what I'll do is I'll scatter some points. So let's do an ISO offset. After this second copy that we made here, I want to just call this, I don't need this null just yet. I want to call this something else. So I'm just going to delete that, and we're going to do an ISO offset right here, and maybe scatter like, something like 8 points inside of this volume. So basically what I can do is I can use metaballs and use metaballs to create forces that will appear and affect our pieces over here in our solver. So I'm just creating those metaballs by adding some points in here, and then I'm actually going to do another copy to points. And I'm going to copy a metaball to these 10 points or 8 points that I've scattered inside of this sphere. Now I want that that scatter to change with every frame. So I'm actually going to change the global seed here to be at frame. So now we get a new arrangement of points every frame. So now I'll grab a metaball, and I'm going to wire in the scatter to the second input of the copy to points and the metaball into the first. And the metaball is huge, so I'm going to bring the size of it down. We're just going to bring, not the weight, but the radius down to something a bit smaller. And you can see that once the radius of it gets a bit smaller, you can see that it's starting to kind of create this blobby shape in the shape of those scatter points that we created. So it's kind of creating these different kind of shapes as it goes down and gets towards the bottom. I think maybe to avoid it getting too sparse towards the bottom, maybe I'll bring the radius up just slightly. So I'm doing something like 0.0129. That seems good. So it kind of is this blob up towards the top. Maybe I'll just bring the radius down slightly more. Let's go back down to something like that. And to make up for it, maybe I'll go down to like We'll go down to something a little bit smaller. So middle mouse clicking over this, maybe 0.05, but I'll increase the number of points that are being scattered, so it's a little bit more intense. Yeah, maybe let's bring this up to a radius of, we'll do 0.095 for right now. And as it gets down to the bottom, it'll get a little bit crazy down there. We'll see if it's really how it affects our sim in just a second here. So now that we've got this metaball, we just need to create a force. So we throw it on a force node, and we're just going to do a radial force, and I'm going to give a value of just 1,000, something crazy at first, so that we can see if it's actually doing something. So the radial force versus the directional force, the radial force is just going to have it exploding outward away from the center of the metaball. And the metaball is jumping to here because it actually doesn't have a point to start with, because our carve is actually set to go to 0. So really there is nothing here. So if we wanted to avoid that, I could just set my second U to some really tiny value like 0.001. And so now on our first frame, we haven't fully deleted our curve. There's actually a point there. So now that metaball will kind of just travel along that curve like so. So over here in our DOP network, let's just throw down a pop metaball force. And wire that into the third input of the rigid body solver. You could probably put it in either one. It doesn't really matter. It's just sort of the order in which things happen. I'll just put it into the third one for now. And then the force that we want to use is a SOP path, and I'll just label this using a null. We'll call this the force. And I'll just put that right in there. Cool. So let's go and play this down and see what we get. You can see that as it's going through, it is applying that force to our simulation, wherever that metaball goes. It's a little bit big. I want to see if I can actually I've got this sphere here. I'm going to see if I can actually, I'm just going to option drag, alt drag this off to the side. I'm going to use a different sphere to copy onto the points. So this sphere is about that big. I want to like maybe bring my sphere down so that my ISO offset is a little bit smaller. And so my scatter points are closer together. And I'm going to also turn off relax iterations. And let's see what our meta ball looks like now. It's still a little bit big. I'm going to try bring it down in size a little bit more. Something like 0.05. That's good. And let's see what we get now. I'm going to bring, now that we know that it's actually working, I'm going to bring the force down to about 100 and play this back now. You can see it's just blasting pieces of this away. Which is cool. Now, it's a little bit extreme still, but what I also wanted to do was add some drag forces. So, and some anti-gravity so that this could kind of like have this dreamlike kind of explosion. So there's a scene in Inception where Leonardo DiCaprio and Ellen Page are talking outside in a cafe where they're in a dream, and all the parts of the market around them are exploding in this sort of like dreamy way as the dream is falling apart. These like little food stands would explode, and then they would like sort of experience these insane drag forces that would slow them down, and they'd sort of like drift dreamily through space. So I want to sort of incorporate a little bit of that. So I'm going to throw down a drag. I've got this pop drag force. I'm going to put that over here, and I'm going to just disable gravity for the time being. I'll reintroduce it later, but I want to just play around with these drag forces and see what we can get. Also, I think that at this point, I want to add, instead of having this force create a force that is like radially outward, I actually want to work with a direction. So I'm going to switch to a directional force. And I want the direction to be in the positive x-axis, so I'm going to switch the direction from 001 to 100, x, y, and z, like that. Then what I'll do is I will make the axial force be about 100 as well. So I've got my forces coming in from our SOP setup here, and those are being applied by the metaball force. And then I've got my drag force here. I'm going to set my air resistance. Maybe I'll just crank that up to 2 just so that it has a little bit more of an impact. And let's just see what we get now. So now it should be like kicking pieces off to the right more so than just straight outward. That's cool. It is doing that. It is launching our pieces off to the right. Then they're experiencing some drag and slowing down, which is cool. But I'm not like it's doing it constantly wherever this wherever these metaballs are, and I want to kind of introduce sort of an interval. I don't want it to be constantly blasting pieces off to the right. I want it to feel more like pops or explosions that are happening. So I'm gonna go and what we can do here is just use a little switcher with a modulo. So I'm gonna throw down a switch, and this is basically going to, oops, not a sweep, but a switch. And what the switch is going to do is it's going to, we can actually set up a modulo here to choose based off of the frame, whether it actually applies the force or whether it chooses a null that will do nothing. And we'll name it so. This null is nothing, and we want it to switch between adding this force and doing nothing. And maybe we'll do that like every 6th frame. So we'll say, and we only want it to happen up to frame 96, because once we get, if you look at our forces, once we get up to frame 96, it's still generating forces down here, and we want it to kind of stop once it gets down to, like, say, around here. So what we can do is we can just add a little expression here. So remember, this will evaluate to 1 when the expression is true, and will evaluate to 0 when the expression is false. So what I might do is actually reverse this. So I'm going to hit Shift R. So really what's going to happen is it's going to be doing nothing by default, and then we're going to switch it on whenever this value is true. You could still write it either way. I just find it easier to think about when I'm saying I want it to be true when I want it to do something. I don't know. It's just personal preference. So right here, what we'll do is we'll say at frame modulo, which is the percent symbol, at frame modulo 6 equals, so I'm going to say a double equals there because that's like how you would write a logic, like a Boolean logic, and say double equals 2. So basically what that's going to do is if we just go here and highlight our switch and play it back, on frame 1, there is no force. On frame 2, it appears. And then on 3, 4, 5, 6, there's nothing there. 7, and then 8, it comes back. So this is the reason why I wrote in frame mod 6 equals 2, is because I want this to appear every 6th frame. But remember how it's doing a remainder, basically. It's saying whenever this frame is like a multiple of 6, or is divisible by 6 or divisible by a number, and then has like a remainder 2, is when it's actually going to turn on. So I've offset this because I want this actually to have the first explosion appear on frame 2. So I just say frame mod 6 equals 2, and then it'll go every 6th frame after that. So 8, 14, etc. If I wanted this to appear on frame 1, I could do it like so, and then we literally have a force on frame 1, on frame 7, 13, and so on. Now, I chose frame 2 because I found that it worked better for my sim. I don't think the sim will actually evaluate if the force is actually applied on frame 1. It needs to be applied on frame 2. So that's just why I'm doing it this way. So the other thing I'll do is say, I'll also want to say that so it's frame mod 6 is equal to 2, and I also want it to be less than, and I want my frame number to be less than, oops, sorry, I put the wrong thing in here. So frame mod 6 equals 2, and so that's 2 ampersand symbols, and frame is also less than 72. That basically means that this whole thing, in order for this to evaluate true, also has to be less than 72. So if I crank this out, it happens every 6 frames up until frame 72, and then after 72 it stops. Like so. Cool. So now let's see what our sim is looking like. Cool, so after letting that cache for a couple seconds, we get sort of this effect where we've got these explosions and these pieces go flying off. But you can notice that they're spinning like crazy. And one of the things that I would want to do is, well, first off, I want the pieces to not spin so violently forever. I want there to be drag applied to those pieces as well in terms of their rotation. Not just their position. So you can see that they're slowing down nicely, but they're still just spinning wildly violent due to their spin, their angular rotations that were applied. Also, another thing is I'm noticing that this force is like very linear. Like all these pieces are moving right, just off to the right, and I kind of want them to have a little bit more variety. So I think what I would do here as well is also reintroduce some of the radial force. So I'm going to turn the radial force back on to start off with, and just see what that gets us. That adds a little bit of any motion. Obviously, it hasn't. Our sim is out of date, so I'm just going to control click the brain. That resets the sim, and play this down a little bit. You can see the pieces are flying off in all sorts of directions. That's adding just a little bit more randomness to it, which is nice. Now let's see if we can do something about that angular rotation. So one of the things that's in here is there's also a pop drag. If you noticed when we were doing pop drag, there's also this pop drag spin. Now when I use this, for me, it doesn't seem like it wants to work. If I click play, pieces of the sim just start to disappear, and it's clearly not working. So we're left to figure out drag on our own. So now if I go over here and I select my geometry, I'm looking down in my geometry spreadsheet. I got my RBD packed object 1 here, and I want to look at the what attributes I have to mess around with to see if I can mess with the angular velocity. I just got to go and select this geometry right here underneath my packed object, and then I get all my positions, names, bullet, a bunch of bullet attributes, etc. And if I go all the way out here, all the way to the end, you can see I get these W, X, Y, and Z. These W's represent angular velocity. It's just one of those things you eventually figure out after messing around with this stuff for a while. So we've got this W attribute. What we could do is maybe apply a multiplier to it so that it slows the angular velocity down over time. And because we're working with packed geometry, we can use a pop-vop inside of our sim. So let's do that. Just going to throw down a pop-vop here. We're just going to throw it in right after the metaball force. And now in here, what we can do is we can just bind in this angular velocity and multiply it by a parameter. We can create our multiplier. So I'm going to bind, and I'm going to bind in W, because this isn't a part of our normal velocity is a part of our normal, usual suspects over here in terms of attributes, but angular velocity isn't. So we're going to bind in W. The type is going to be a vector. I found that I have to name this like explicitly for it to work appropriately. It seemed like I was having issues when I was setting this up before without doing it this way. So I'm just going to specify that W is a vector, and then I'm going to bind export. And I'm going to bind export W as well. So it is exporting a vector. So now if I do like multiply in here, I can multiply it by my own number, which I'll provide as a parameter. I'm going to create a parameter that is called multiplier. And I'll call this label multiplier, like so. And then I will jump back out of my pop-vop, and we've got our multiplier. Its value is 0. And so if I'm multiplying this by a value that is less than 1 every frame, it's going to gradually slow things down. So it's going to be if the angular momentum, if the speed of that totals up to be something like 1 every 1 on the first frame, the next frame it's going to be 0.9, and then on the frame after that it's going to be 0.81 or some fraction of that, whatever, 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9. So it'll eventually slow down. Just to make sure that it's working, I'm going to set it to some extreme value, so really it's going to decay that rotation off very quickly. And it's really obvious right here with the piece of the arm that came off. You can see that that arm comes off and it's rotating, and then it eventually just stops rotating because we have multiplied that value down so dramatically. So that's good. I don't want it to be quite so dramatic, so I'm just going to increase that multiplier up to 0.8, something like that. Cool. And just playing that down a little bit and playing it back. You can see we get this sort of kind of dreamy explosion. I think I might actually bring, let's just bring this drag up a little bit. I'm going to set the air resistance up to something like maybe 3 and see what we get for that. Just so that the pieces don't fly quite so far away. Another thing that I'm noticing here is that after looking at this, that I am pretty sure that these metaball forces are actually pulling instead of pushing, because if you look at the icon, it's an attractor force. The icon kind of shows an attraction, so a positive value in the force is actually going to be an attraction force. I'm going to put a negative sign in front of this force so that it's actually a repulsive force. And maybe, let's see, we'll just try that and see what kind of results it gets us. So I'm just going to go back over here to the sim and just play that back real quick. It didn't make too much of a difference, but I feel like when it gets to this section over here, near the chest, what I'd want it to do is actually be more or less inside the body and causing the explosion to be forced outwards. That's happening that's happening in somewhat of a sense, but I feel like because this because these metaballs are really right on the surface of our geometry, we're kind of missing an opportunity for having it exploding more or less outward. So what I want to do is actually bring the curve that drives this metaball inside the body slightly. So I can do that actually by using some normals. So if we look over here at our geometry here, we've got our curve that we created here, and it is being put onto this geometry. Now this geometry, let's see, it has vertex normals. I want to create some point normals and then transfer them to this curve so that I can actually move the curve along its normals to be inside the body a little bit more. So let's just create over here. I'm going to split off this polyreduce here. I'm just going to bring this over here, and then I'm going to add a normal. And I want this to be a point normal. So if I turn this on now, it's no longer those green normals, but it's these blue normals. Just by hitting this little visualizer right here, I can visualize these blue normals. Means we've got point normals, as opposed to beforehand without this normal, there were these green vertex normals. So we want these point normals, and we're going to transfer that normal attribute onto our curve. So if I use an attribute transfer, and in the left input we got our curve, that's the thing we want to transfer to, and in the right input we've got our normal, or our geo right here. So we've got our geo right here. So in here, what I want to do is transfer, I'm going to untick primitives, and I want to transfer the normals onto this curve. So now, prior to this, if we look at the normals, I visualize the normals right here. There are no normals on this curve, but if I turn this on, you can see that there are normals on this curve that are actually representing where, they're pointing away from the surface of the object. Wherever this object is on the surface, these normals are pointing away from it. And then what I could do is actually use a peak. So a peak SOP basically moves an object along its normal. So throw down a peak right after that attribute transfer. And what we can do is just decrease the distance of this curve a little bit. I don't want to recompute point normals. I just want to leave them the way they are. And it's a little bit nasty. I can just throw it on a smooth afterwards. And in fact, I don't really want to be doing this for the activation region. I just want to be doing this for our forces. So I'm going to actually grab I'm going to be grabbing this chunk right here. I'm going to just shake that off, and we can use our carve, and I'm going to bring our carve over here and bring this in like so. So after it's all said and done, we have a separate branch here, and then we'll just copy onto this. But I need my delete back, so I'm gonna just make a duplicate of this delete by option dragging or alt dragging it over here, and then wiring this into the second input. So now we get our 1 point, but it is slightly inside of our geometry. So if let's just show the force right here. Now if I go back up here and template my statue, you can see that that force is now sort of more, it's more closely embedded inside of this geometry than it was previously. So we can get some more. So that origin, the where the force is originating from is inside, causing more drama, if you will. So let's see what we get with that. Go back over here. Let's turn off the normals display and check out what our sim looks like. Nice. So this is what we got for that. Boom, 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 boom. It's all these sort of explosions that occur, and drag forces slow all those particles down nicely. And I think like this is starting to look really fun to me. I think like only things that I kind of want to do is maybe I want to just like add a little bit more. I just want to art direct this a little bit more, like where the torso starts to rotate out. I really want my the torso to rotate out a little bit more. It's a little bit underwhelming how much it doesn't really move right here. So maybe what I'll do is just create another metaball force that I just activate right around this time. So it looks like the torso detaches at around frame, let's say frame 63 to be sure, is when it really is detached. So I can just do another switch, and so I'll do a switch. Right, let's see, switch. So I'll do a switch, and then I'll say I want this to be at frame is equal to 63. I want it to turn on, and I'm going to have it grab another force. So I'm going to just create a metaball. Just going to do this one from scratch, kind of. I'm going to just make the radius maybe a little bit. I'm going to half the radius, so we'll do a 0.5 radius. And then I'm just going to use the move tool to kind of put it in position. I still have point snapping on, so I'm going to turn that off. But I'm going to move it so that it kind of gets knocked. So if I push it to the left here underneath the torso, it should generate an outward force to the right. If I, once I apply a force to it, it'll generate a force that's pointing to the right that should push this piece of the torso out a little bit. So I'm just going to throw down another force here. And since this is all feeding into our forces, it should all just work. So I'm going to go like this. On frame 63, it's true. Boom, it turns off. So it turns on frame 63, and then we move forward. So, let's just specify what exactly we want this force to be. I think what I'll do is I'll start with maybe another directional force. We're going to put this in the X direction as well. And I also want that, this is the axial force. Now, I never really talked about this. The axial force means how much force it is that goes along this direction, this axis that we provide it. Vortex and spiral force basically are doing, kind of a sucking or pulling in action or rotating around that axis type of force. Not really what I'm interested in right now. I just want to work with this axial force. So let's maybe just give it a value, an axial force value of 100, and see what that gets us on frame 63. So let's go back over to our sim here, select a node in our .NET, and click play. So we're going to have to wait all the way up until frame 63 to see any action, but it shouldn't take too long to get there. I'm kind of okay. So I've let this cache just a little bit, and let's just play it back. So we've got these cool explosions. The torso goes flying off to the right. I'm kind of digging it, and then it kind of slows down. That's cool. I think like maybe at this point, since we're close to the end of where all these explosions are happening, I don't want these particles to drift a lot. And you can also see that some of them are actually coming to rest. If you look keep your eye right in here, you can see that some of these particles are actually coming to a complete stop. And that's because the RBD packed object has sleeping turned on. So sleeping basically means that the bullet solver is going to look for particles that are moving below a certain linear speed and angular speed, and then tell them that they can just stop being a part of the simulation and just come to rest. I'm just going to disable that so that those pieces keep on moving. And the next thing I want to do is, I think after we get to about frame 72, I'm going to decrease the damping effects of our drag forces so that these pieces continue to drift sort of at a constant speed. So let's just maybe when we get, right about here, frame 72, I'm just going to go into our pop vop and our pop drag. So for our pop vop, I'm going to set the multiplier. I'm going to hit a keyframe there, and then I'm going to turn off the brain so that I don't have any recooking happening. I'm going to go out to frame 96 and then turn the multiplier up to 1. I'm not to 0, because we're actually lower numbers will actually decay the speed faster, but a value of 1 will keep it constant because it's just multiplying itself by 1 every frame. So I'm going to just keyframe this from 0.8 to 0.1 from 72 to 96. Then we'll go to pop drag, and I'm going to key down its air resistance. So in this is the opposite. Actually, higher values will slow it down more, and lower values will slow it down less. So I'm going to go to frame 72, hold down Alt, and click on air resistance, and then let's go up to frame 96, and then bring air resistance down to 0, and click Alt one more time. So now when we play it back, it's out of date right now, but this should have more of a constant drift. And the next thing I want to do is actually reintroduce some gravity. So I actually want to set the gravity to begin increasing from frame, let's say from frame 96 to frame 144. So at frame 144, I'll go select gravity. It's set to -9.8. That's cool. I'll just hold down Alt and click that right now to set a keyframe there. Then I'll go back to frame 96 and set this to 0 and set another keyframe there. So it's going to be slowly turning on gravity over the few frames after that. But gravity is disabled, so I'm actually going to unbypass it. And then another important thing to check here is the default operation of gravity is set to set initial, and we want to have it set always. Because set initial just basically means it'll take whatever value we had at frame 0, which is 0, and it'll apply that forever. But when you have set always turned on, it will actually update every frame. It'll look at this node and say, has gravity changed at all? Oh, okay, it has. All right, cool. Now let's apply the new version of whatever that is. So I'm going to go back to frame 0, and let's turn the brain back on and see what we got. Our sim's out of date. I'm just going to control click the brain as well and click play. All right, and that has done caching. Let's just play that back real quick. So we got all their pieces, and then gravity kicks in, and they all drop to the ground. I think that one thing that I'm seeing is like as it drops to the ground, it all just becomes very fast towards the end. And I kind of want to maintain just a slight hint of that dreaminess that we had before. So I'm just going to not increase gravity so much. So I'm just going to turn the brain off, go to frame 144, and then maybe I'll just set the gravity to something really tiny like -3 instead of -9.8. So now it should just have slightly less of an impact when it hits the ground. And let's control click the brain, make sure the brain's turned on, and play that down one more time. So now that that's done caching, we play this back. We're kind of left with that, which is nice. It's just not quite as crazy of a impact on the ground. Now, I don't know if you're thinking what I'm thinking, but this skull is definitely not doing enough. I feel like the skull should either be coming off to the right more or something like that. It's just sort of drifting, and clearly the head of the character is going to be sort of if it isn't doing, I mean, if it isn't doing something that is I don't know, it doesn't have to be doing something that's like totally perfect and totally interesting. It doesn't need to be the center of attention, but if it's doing something quite as boring as what it's doing right now, I feel like it's going to be more noticeable if we don't do something to tweak it. So I think what I'll do is just the same type of thing that I did when I was doing adding this custom force in over here. Just want to add another one to kind of launch the head off to the side as well when it breaks off. So it looks like it breaks off around frame around frame 30, looks like 33 it starts to move around. So what I'm going to do is just add another force in over here. Basically, to do that, I'm just going to select these 3 nodes in my SOP network. I'm just going to alt drag them off to the side to create another switcher and just wire this through like so. And all I got to do is go to this switcher and set it to, instead of frame 63, set it to frame 33, and then just move my meta ball up. So I'm going to select my translation, bring this meta ball up here. Maybe I'll decrease its size. I'm just going to middle mouse on the radius to bring the whole thing down. Might have to bring the Y radius up a little bit. And maybe I'll just bring it down so that it has more of an effect on the lower part of the neck. So maybe it'll like kind of rotate a little bit counterclockwise off in this direction. And maybe I don't need quite so much force for this one, so maybe we'll do just 20. And let's just see how that plays out. So I'm going to go back over to the sim and just play this a little bit and see what we get. That's cool. It looks like it's actually rotating clockwise. Maybe I can get it to rotate counterclockwise. Let's see. Looks like my force is like so. I think I'm going to just bring maybe the size of my force. I'm going to scale it down in Y and really just sort of jam it in on that lower part of the neck like so. And let's just go and try that one more time. That didn't work. So let's just bring the size of the meta ball. Let's just bring it up a little bit, and I'm actually going to increase the force to say 60. And try it again. Control click the brain, and here we go. Now I'm not really getting that counterclockwise motion when I look at this, but I'm kind of liking the way it's going anyways. Seems pretty cool to me. So that's good. Let's see. I think that just looking at final tweaks here, I'm just playing this back. Final tweaks, I really kind of want to see. I think that the decay on the drag is a little bit too intense. So going out to frame 72, just going to turn off the brain. I'm going to put this multiplier up to 0.9 just so that it's less dramatic of a decay. I want to see a little bit more rotation in this arm, and I feel like the pieces are are slow enough that we can the rotation is coming down slow enough that we can give it just a little bit more, allow it a little bit more flexibility and that freedom to do what it wants to do in that regard. And there was one other thing. I think that the other thing that I want to do is just try to slightly bring down the main forces that we have over here. I think that they're a little intense, maybe yet. So maybe I'll just bring the radial force down to 80 and the axial force down to 80, just to slightly decrease them a little bit. And I'm just going to play this back yet again. So select our node in our sim and turn the brain back on. Control click the brain to reset it and click play. Cool. So this is sort of cached out to about frame 192. I don't think I really want it to go that long. Just kind of want to play it back and see what it looks like kind of in real time. I'm happy with that. I think that's cool. I think like if things weren't breaking apart very well, you might want to adjust playing with maybe adjusting the strength of your glue constraints towards the end. I'm happy with 10 for mine, but again, if you did want to animate this, you would want to change your default operation from set initial to set always or something like that. And that would allow you to kind of have more control over that. So yeah, I think at this point, what we do is we just cache it. So let's go back down here. This is where we're importing. And what I can do is throw down a file cache here, and we're just going to do the usual. Let's call it, we're going to cache it into a file next to our hip. I don't want to put it in the geo folder. I want to put it in a cache folder. And I'm going to I want it to be named after this. So I'm going to call this the RBD cache. And then up here, if I put in $OS, it's going to grab RBD cache and put it into its own folder. And then I want to make another folder based off the version, which is going to be the hip name. And then hip name.$OS $f.bgo.sc. And if I play this back, I think like up until, you know, frame 192 is fine. Yeah, we'll just cache this out to frame 192. So I'm going to right click on the end and say delete channels, and then put in a 190 hard code in a 192 there, and then I will just save this to disk. And it should be done pretty quickly since that's already in memory. It's just basically waiting for the disk to write. So there, that's been written, and then we can look at it with our high-res pieces. So I'm going to just increase the size of this window and deselect. Let's go back to frame 0 and maybe frame this up a little bit better, and I'm just going to run a flipbook. And I'm hitting escape because it is flipping too long. But I'm going to select my, if I go over here, it's going to pull up mplay, and let's play that back, see what it looks like. With our high-res geo now that we're using that transform pieces node right here. So let's click play. So we get this nice dreamy explosion, and then it falls on the ground and breaks apart more. And we get a little piece of the skull rolling off to the left. That's kind of fun. But yeah, you can sit here and tweak all these settings to your heart content, but that's just sort of what kind of my process is, you know, kind of bringing things in, animating forces, playing around with them, and just having a fun time. Then, you know, fracturing that stuff and putting it on, putting high-res pieces on the low-res pieces and all that kind of magic. So now let's just prep this and get it out of here so we can bring it into Cinema for some rendering. So we're going to do the usual thing, which is turn it into an Alembic file, but I want to clean off some of these attributes first. So we've got our name attributes. I don't want those. Might want to keep these inside and outside groups though, in case I wanted to shade like the interior pieces differently from the outside pieces. So to show what I mean, if I were to go here and throw down a color, like so, and I'm going to just set the color to red, and I'm going to set it to only color the inside pieces. You can see if I get in real close here that the inside pieces here are it's kind of hard to see because it's actually it's coloring the points, but once this breaks open, you can see that the inside is all red, and that's basically means that that's sort of our polyfaces. So we can assign a different shader in Cinema to these red parts if we wanted to, by having these separate groups go over with our geo. So that's kind of fun. That actually looks pretty grotesque if you ask me. Very very gory. So let's go and throw down, I'm going to just throw down, let's clean up this geo by throwing down a attribute delete. And in here, we can get rid of, let's get rid of the name attribute. So I'm going to get rid of name in the point attributes. Vertex attributes, we've got normals, probably don't need them. I'll just delete them. I feel like they would be computed, by default anyways. So then primitive attributes, there are none. Detail attributes, there's varmap. I'm just gonna choose to delete that one as well. So now we've got just our point and velocity. So if we wanted to do motion blur, we could use this velocity attribute. Next, we've got our inside and outside groups that we want to keep, and I just want to get rid of the rest of the groups. So we're going to throw down a group delete. And I'm going to just delete all the groups by using the star, but then use this hat or the caret key or whatever it is. And I'm going to say I don't want to delete inside, and I don't want to delete outside. So now I should just have two groups called inside and outside. So this is all cleaned up. So that's cool. So I've got my inside and my outside group, and I've got my velocity if I wanted to add motion blur, and my position, which I need anyways. Then what I'll do is I'll just throw down a transform lastly, or second to lastly, transform. And we're going to make this the we're going to transform this up to a scale of 100, just to put it back at like Cinema 4D sized pieces, and then throw down an alembic, a ROP alembic output, that is. And then here we can choose where we want this to output to. So I'm going to output to hip slash, I like to make a folder called ABC export, and then I like to name my files something like, let's do backtick $OS whoops, I accidentally hit escape, and that puts me back to frame 0, or ground, yeah, back to frame 0 on this one. So I'm going to say ABC underscore export slash backtick $OS. Oh my gosh, I did it again. All right. So I'm going to say here, I'm going to say ABC export slash backtick $OS, backtick again, and then underscore backtick $hip name backtick, and then .abc. And that should, if I drag this out a little bit so I can see it a little bit better, middle mouse click, it goes into my lesson files, ABC export, ROP Alembic 1, lesson 8, RBD Crumble version 1. Cool. I'm just going to name this something that makes sense. In fact, honestly, I don't really need this $OS. Now I'm looking at it, it's a little bit redundant. We use this file to create one asset, and that should just work if we use hipname.abc. So our final output will be an Alembic file named after the file that we just created. So, or after the file that we are working in. So that's good enough for me. And we'll call this RBD's out. And I need a frame range, so I'll go from frame 1 to frame 192. So frame range, I'm going to right click, delete the channels over here, and set it to 192. And it's going to write out all these it's going to write out all this high-res geometry into a RBD, into an Alembic file that we can use over in Cinema. So I'm just going to do that real quick, and I'll be back in 1 second. And that is finished. So I'll just open up a copy of Cinema, and we'll just open this up in there and see what we got. I'll hit Control-Shift-O, and I will, let's see, navigate to my project folder, ABC Export, and grab this file that we created. It looks like it's about 2.5 gigs, not too bad. I've seen worse. Frame rate's 24 frames a second. That's good. The scale is 1. That's good. And we will do that. Sounds good. Close this, and we've got our fractured geo in here. And if I play that back, it's working. Awesome. It looks like there was some leftover points here. It doesn't look like it's really affecting, but if you wanted to go back and I did deal with something like this in an earlier in the lesson where I talk about kind of transitioning pieces over to Cinema. I kind of sorted this out before, but we could just delete this, or just kind of turn it off. Doesn't really matter. But we got our selection sets, so we've got all of our interior faces we could apply material to. So if we wanted to create a new shader, a new material, and so do something kind of like what we did before, maybe this time we'll do something like blue. We could apply that to our object here, but then just have it only select the inside faces. So we could shade separately, and then maybe do like another shader for the outside, something like that. So we've got a shader on the outside and a shader on the inside, things like that. And then we've got our velocities here as well. You can see that it's just these tags we can use to control the motion blur in our scene as well. So I go over that in the general lesson about workflow, but in general, that brings us to the end of this lesson. We've created this totally customizable, controllable rigid body simulation using a 3D scan with a skull. I mean, we've just hit so many bases in this lesson. So I know that it was a lot to cover. It was a lot to think about, a lot to learn all at once, but I feel like, you know, you can come back to this lesson. You don't have to know all of this right away. This should serve as sort of a reference for you. You can come back here whenever you need to fracture something and look and find those little pieces that you learned in here and relearn them. And eventually they'll start to stick. Like there's been lessons like this that I've gone through multiple times, and slowly over time, all the bits of information may seem overwhelming at first, but they eventually start to stick, just like anything else, and they start to make more sense. So I know that this is quite a deep dive, but I hope that it's just a good reference point that you can come back to and be able to build more and more complicated setups as you go on your journey in learning how to become great at using Houdini. So in the next chapter, we're going to look at doing some stuff with, I believe it's vellum. And so I will catch you over in those lessons.